It's a pleasure to be joined by David Conn. Now, David works for The Guardian as a journalist, and over the last 20 to 30 years, he's covered the Hillsborough disaster. And we're going to be talking a bit about the basics of what happened and where we're at now, ahead of a lecture that David has at Manchester University about the disaster and his work covering it. So, first off, David, thanks for joining us. And can you just explain a little bit about your role and what you've done over the last kind of 20 years?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I've been a journalist for quite a long time now, and for a long, long time, I worked on investigations and investigative reporting on kind of like some of the serious issues of football. And obviously, the Hillsborough disaster uh, wa- was a terrible, terrible disaster and huge in football's history and place in society, if you like. Um, and also, I started first ever writing about it in 1996, so coming up to 30 years ago. And at that time, the bereaved families and survivors were fighting their campaign for justice because they'd suffered a huge injustice in the legal processes that followed the disaster. And the South Yorkshire Police had blamed the supporters rather than taking responsibility for themselves. And the families were fighting that. So I've been involved in writing about that and the campaign for justice for nearly 30 years. So this lecture that I'm doing at Manchester University, which is on Thursday, February the 13th, and there is a live link to it for anybody who wants to watch it, is going to be talking about how the legal system failed the families for so long, for 32 years basically, or forever really, after the disaster.
And so where we've come a long way in the last 20 years in terms of achieving some kind of justice for the families. And we of course won't it'll take a lot longer than half an hour to go into all of that. But what I want to have a look at is where we're at today in terms of what kind of justice have the families had? Who and has there ever been prosecutions? And will there ever, do you think, be prosecutions in the future over the alleged cover up? So I think we'll start with the basics really. What did the Hillsborough inquests that happened in Warrington? What did they reveal for anyone who's new to the subject?
The inquests that were held in Warrington from 2014 to 2016, so 2 years, is the longest court case ever in British history in front of a jury. And that was held because finally, after 21 years, the original inquest from 1991 that found that the people had been killed and it was certified to be accidental death had finally been quashed after the families campaign. So that means that finally it had been overturned in court, which is what the families had been fighting for 21 years. It was overturned in 2012. And the new inquests turned into this huge battle in court between the South Yorkshire Police, people who had been officers at the time, and the case that Liverpool supporters were drunk and many of them didn't have tickets and that they weren't cooperative with the police and that they came late. And that had so disrupted things that was a big cause of why the disaster happened, was fully rejected by the jury. And the jury found that the 96, as it was then, it's now 97 because sadly in 2021, Andrew Devine died and was certified to be the 97th person unlawfully killed. And also, the jury was explicitly asked to come to a decision about whether the behaviour of Liverpool supporters contributed to, in essence, the disaster, but to the dangerous situation that developed outside the ground, outside the Leppings Lane end. And the jury came back and said, no behaviour by Liverpool supporters contributed to the disaster. Therefore, it's been found in a court of law at an inquest, which provides death certificates. So it's like there's a certificate of this, that all those years of telling these stories about Liverpool supporters were wholly rejected by the jury, and that no behaviour contributed. And I covered many days of that inquest for the Guardian, and my memory of that and feeling about it is that the jury were able to reach that decision not just because the lawyers for the families were very good, but literally they were just played the film of the crowd. This is a remarkable thing about Hillsborough in some ways, that the police were able to tell these stories, but because it was a football match, a prestigious football match, it was an FA Cup semi-final, it was on television. And so outside as well, the crowd was filmed. I think the BBC had a camera outside, Sheffield Wednesday had cameras, CCTV, the police had film and photographs. And so they just played so much of the video. And you could see that people hadn't arrived, in large numbers late. There was no evidence that anyone could see of anyone being drunk, causing trouble. And so that is the verdict that the jury came to.
Something that trial didn't really cover, though, was the alleged cover-up from West Yorkshire Police and beyond. That's something you've had a big area of work in. So could you just explain to the viewers and the readers why there is still a sense of injustice over Hillsborough despite getting the
Yeah.
verdict of unlawful killing? And do you think there will ever be any prosecutions over the alleged cover-up?
As you said at the beginning, the families have come a hugely long way because they secured that inquest verdict. And it came in April 2016. So 27 years it took them from the disaster. But once you get a verdict of unlawful killing, plus a whole narrative of the police has been not believed. All these stories have just not been believed by a jury. Then you would expect people to be held accountable. So there have been prosecutions. So David Duckenfield, the match commander, who was a chief superintendent at South Yorkshire Police, who was found to have been grossly negligent by the jury at the inquest, because that's the basis of the unlawful killing verdict. He was prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter, but in 2019 the jury acquitted him, so he was found not guilty of that on a criminal charge. 3 police officers were charged with an offence called perverting the course of public justice for a process of amending the statements of police officers after the disaster. So police officers had made statements, and then there was a process of reviewing them and suggesting that they be amended, right? And that case was basically stopped or thrown out because the judge ruled that those statements, the police statements, had been made for principally the first public inquiry that was held after the disaster, which was by Lord Justice Taylor, the famous Taylor reports. And the judge in 2021, and that's how long it all took, found that the Taylor inquiry, the format of the Taylor inquiry, wasn't a course of public justice. It didn't, in effect, qualify as a court case. It was more like what I think he called an administrative inquiry. So therefore, even if the statements had been amended, in a way that was very serious, and he didn't say whether it was or not, but even if they had been, they wouldn't have committed that criminal offence of perverting the course of public justice. And that was the basis on which they were acquitted. They were formally found not guilty. So the only person to be convicted of any criminal offence as a result of what happened at Hillsborough is the person who was Secretary of Sheffield Wednesday at the time, called Graham McCrell. And he was prosecuted for the way that for the arrangements for how people would enter the Leppings Lane end and enter the turnstiles in basically what numbers they had to go through which turnstiles. But that was a health and safety offence that he was charged with, not with a negligence type offence that caused the disaster, just a health and safety offence about those arrangements. And he was fined £6,500. And that is the only criminal conviction of anybody in relation to a disaster in which 97 people were unlawfully killed due to the gross negligence of the match commander, and a huge number of other failings were identified, and a whole police narrative was mounted to blame the victims, to blame the people who'd suffered in the crush, and make allegations of misbehaviour against them, which have been completely disbelieved. There have been no convictions of anyone for that, or any disciplinary proceedings, I don't think. And to answer your final question, Sam, no, I don't think there will be any further prosecutions. I think that's accepted, even by the family. I don't mean accepted like they've come to terms with it. I just mean I think everybody knows that that's the end of the process.
And that's where we kind of come on to the Hillsborough Law Campaign, because without wanting to speak for anyone who was directly affected by the tragedy, 27 years plus is a long time to be campaigning. And then to have those inquest verdicts and then carry on further to try and get prosecutions is a lot. And so it feels like we've moved into a case now where where the families and the Hillsborough Law Campaign is trying to safeguard against it happening in the future. And so that's where the Hillsborough Law Campaign comes in. And I'd like to ask, what are the aims of the Hillsborough Law, or what is being called the Hillsborough Law Campaign? And where are we in terms of something actually being introduced in government?
So we have a more positive story to tell about that, because this government, the Labour government that was elected last summer, they have committed to introducing it. There are two quite basic elements to the Hillsborough Law. One is something called a duty of candour, being candid, being honest, and that the police and all public authorities should have a legal required duty of candour. They have to not only be honest and not mount a cover up, but also positively help, positively give information to inquiries and investigations. Obviously, particularly after a public disaster, but to have a duty of candour as part of their holding of public office. And the Labour government has committed to introducing that, but I think there's still discussions about how exactly will that work in practice, which, I'm sure that there can be quite involved discussions, and that, it could be quite narrowly framed or it could be quite widely framed. And the second part of Hillsborough Law is that bereaved families and victims, after a public disaster, should have funding, money, so they can pay for equal legal representation, lawyers to represent them at the subsequent inquiries and inquests, because that was an awful part of the Hillsborough story, that after the disaster, there was no legal aid, there was no funding for the families at the inquests. And I was completely shocked by this when I was first told about it, when I first started reporting on it nearly 30 years ago, and it's not changed that much since. And so what happened was the families themselves, so the police and other bodies who were at the inquest, so Sheffield City Council, the ambulance service, I think the fire service, they're public bodies, right? So they had public money to pay for the best barristers and best lawyers you could have. But the victims don't get any money to fund legal representation. So the families who'd lost their loved ones in the disaster and suffered such a catastrophe had to find the money themselves. And I believe that, I think I was always told that 42 families managed to contribute £3,000 each. That was the arrangement. And they managed to afford, I think, one barrister and, some solicitors to support the barrister against all these teams of lawyers that were basically marshalling, especially the police, obviously, marshalling this narrative against the victims that the families felt was besmirching their loved ones, and trying to portray the people who'd suffered as having misbehaved and somehow caused it themselves.
One of the reasons the Hillsborough campaign is so important is because even in this day and age, the scales are unbalanced. They're weighted towards the people in authority rather than the common person. And so, can you just expand on that and talk about why it's so important we keep Hillsborough in the public awareness?
There are many, many reasons why it should be known about and taught and be in the public mind. There's many, many reasons. I mean, one of them is quite simply to maintain what the truth was. Because obviously, you all know as Liverpool fans that there's terrible chanting and abuse that goes on, that's still repeating the old police lies about that Liverpool supporters misbehaved, that's been comprehensively rejected, by the inquest jury, and so just that makes it urgent still for the truth to be known and accepted by everybody. And obviously, there are many, many reasons for the good of society, as you say, and the good of public awareness, for this to be well known. But I think that for me, there's actually a very particular reason, and this is the subject of the lecture that I'm giving, and that's about how the legal system failed. And that's very, very current, because those final cases were only in 2021 and 2019. So that's now, right? And one thing that I'm going to be saying in my lecture is that when you review all the legal failings and the fact that these completely innocent families suffered, and survivors, people who were themselves victims, but were injured and suffered, that it's so clear what happened. And the Taylor inquiry, the Taylor report, found that the police were responsible, and that the supporters weren't. Within 4 months of the disaster, the report was in August 1989. So how on earth has it taken 32 years? We've had so many different versions of it. 1 minute, the Taylor inquiry comes to that decision. Then the inquest accepts the police case a lot more. Then the families fail in an appeal, or an appeal is rejected in 1993, which is a forgotten part of the injustice that I'm going to be highlighting in my lecture. And then it's nearly 20 years till 2012 of just campaigning, of just suffering so much, of having to lose so much of the quality of their lives and their health in so many ways, fighting against the establishment, fighting against these legal rulings. Finally, they get an inquest a new inquest and the new verdicts after 27 years. And then in the court cases that follow, the same stories about supporters' misbehaviour come out again. And finally, the law has left the families after all that. If you say that the last case was 2021, so they've left the families after 32 years of involvement with the legal system, it's left them with the contradiction that their loved ones were unlawfully killed due to gross negligence, but nobody has been held to account for the unlawful killings. And a whole police narrative has been disbelieved, but nobody's been held to account for that either. And so I want to ask, what are the elements of the legal system that are so fundamentally flawed that they can essentially make such a mess of inquiries and processes that follow 97 innocent people being unlawfully killed at a football match?
And I think your lecture and what we've talked about today is the more general picture about holding authority to account. But sometimes to reach people and to appeal to new people and make them involved is by talking on a direct level. Now, you had a lot of engagement over the years with the families of the people who died at Hillsborough. One of such was Phil Hammond. Phil Hammond was 14 when he died, and his father, also Phil Hammond, he's passed away recently and was a key part of he was chairman of the Hillsborough Family Support Group at one point. And I believe we'd just like
For
to
quite a number of years, actually, Sam.
pay
For
some
quite a
tribute
number of
to
years,
Phil
Phil
and
was the chairman.
also the other people who have done a lot of work over the years to reach some sort of justice.
Yeah, well, Phil Hammond and his wife Hilda were the first Hillsborough family who I ever met. So when I first started wanting to find out about it and report on it for my book that I wrote in 1997, Phil was the vice chairman at the time, but he offered to talk to me, and I went round to their house in Liverpool. Ended up being on a weekday night, working night, and I ended up being there for 3 hours talking about it all. And we always remembered, Phil and Hilda and I always remember that first time that I came. And both of them, just wonderful people. Like, it made a huge impact on me. And some of the things that made a huge impact were just how much they loved Philip Jr., just how much they loved him. And that's the same with all the families. That's what's shone through. Such a terrible experience, such a terrible ordeal. But the way that they've fought all these years and stayed so loyal and held up the memory of their loved ones has really, really shown how much people love their families, their partners, their children. I mean, there were a lot of people actually who were older, who were parents themselves, who died at Hillsborough. So you've got their children actually fighting for the truth and justice for their parents. And Phil was also carrying the actual legal fight at that time. And he just made huge, huge efforts to carry the fight. And, just was an absolute powerhouse. Lovely man as well. Like, everyone just really, really takes to Phil, just loves Phil, and had a great sense of humour. Loved football, loved Liverpool Football Club. So did both his sons, Philip Jr., who died at Hillsborough, and his younger brother Graham. So, and Phil had a misfortune in more recent years. I think it was New Year's Day of 2009. He actually banged his head in the Hillsborough Family Support Group office when someone had donated like £10 or something for, those bands that people used to have to show solidarity. Phil was dropping a receipt into like an in tray, and he banged his head on a shelf above and had a brain hemorrhage and nearly died. And Phil's had to be cared for ever since then. So from 2009 until he just passed away, 16 years. And Hilda's had to care for him all these years. And they went through the inquest and all these processes with Phil having been, you know, in that having have that um, you know, accident. Um, you know, wonderful people, wonderful family people. Had such a happy life. Like I've been always stayed in touch with them and been there since, and you know, done further interviews with them that I've written up for the paper. And they were both 40, I think, at the time of the disaster. And Phil always said what a happy family life they had. Phil Jr. was 14, Graham was 12. They were used to go and watch them play football and just had a lovely family life. Philip goes off to a semi-final, all excited in the sunshine to watch Kenny Dalglish's team play Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest, hoping they'd win and go to Wembley. And like so many others, um, you know, due to police mismanagement and a ground that was unsafe, these lovely, lovely people actually lost their lives.
And it is a somber note, but it is important, especially as people in the Liverpool community or football in general, to do things like this, to talk about it for the good of things like the Hillsborough Law Campaign, but also just to generally keep holding authority to account, to keep talking about things like this. So thanks very much for your time today, David, and also for the lecture at the University of Manchester. And we'll put a link in the description to this so people can watch it. So thank you for coming on today.
Thanks very much for having me, Sam. It's been a real pleasure.